Welcome. Today my AGM interview is with Professor Kerry Sadiq from Queensland University of Technology. The topic of today's conversation is her co-authored paper along with Bronwyn McCready and Ellie Chappell, published in the Australian Journal of Management, special issue on Grand Challenges. The title of the paper is Navigating the Fourth Industrial Revolution, Taxing Automation for Fiscal Sustainability. Here is the interview. So welcome, Kerry. So what are the key insights for industry policymakers and/or employees from your paper published in AGM's special issue on Grand Challenges?
Well, thanks so much for talking to me today, Victoria. It's really exciting to be talking about our paper. We really wanted to achieve two outcomes with this paper. We wanted essentially policymakers and other academics to really think about how we were dealing with income inequality and distributive justice. So, what kind of society do we want to live in? And that is a real grand challenge. How do we want our society to look? And once you've decided how you want your society to look, and we went through various theories, we talked about utilitarianism, we talked about libertarianism, and we talked about Rawls's theory of justice. And once you've decided what you want your society to look like, you need to make sure you've got the revenue to fund that and the kind of regulatory framework to implement the various welfare programs, distribute justice, correct that income inequality. So the second part of the paper then went through some ideas that we had around the kinds of different things you could do within the tax regime to really address that distributive justice, income inequality. And the context or framework that we did all of that in was within the fourth industrial revolution, because what's happening is we have a tax system that is really heavily reliant on personal income tax. And that's changing. It's changing at a rapid rate. We're seeing machines taking over our jobs. So we know from previous studies that income inequality is increasing. We're seeing recently, through other circumstances, unemployment increasing. So we're not going to have that base there to tax. And just to give you an idea, currently in Australia, more than 50% of the government's tax revenue comes from individual income tax. And it's something like around 20% from corporates and only 15% from GST. And people tend to think GST is a huge tax. But when you look at it as part of our overall tax base, it's actually quite small. So they're the grand challenges or the really big ideas that we wanted people to start thinking about when they read our paper.
So sort of picking up on something that you hinted on is that, previously you wrote the paper, now we're experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic. Has the pandemic accentuated, changed the core message in your paper? And I think, as you're saying, picking up on those sort of secondary effects of unemployment, changes in supply chain, and the power of companies and global companies. So what are your thoughts on that? How has COVID-19 impacted in this research space?
Well, it's incredible to think that we wrote this paper having no idea what was ahead of us, because, I think we could remove the fourth industrial revolution and put in the current pandemic or the current pandemic crisis, or however you want to word it, and the paper would become even more significant, because the pandemic, we know, has really highlighted some flaws in some countries' understanding of what they should be doing around income inequality, ensuring that safety net for their individual citizens. And I think Australia has done a pretty good job when we start comparing them to other countries. And we have a look at the OECD data around that. So it's certainly highlighted, again, those distributive justice concepts that I was talking about, and people don't realize it, but there are a lot of the decisions that they're making in terms of what they believe society should be providing. But there's only one way to provide that, and that's, generally throughout our tax system. So people are making decisions around whether they want to take a libertarian approach where the government is really just a gatekeeper. And we've seen in the US that kind of approach where they haven't had the kind of lockdowns we've had. There's not necessarily that support for individual citizens. We've seen capitalism, effectively win out. Whereas I think in Australia, we have adopted more of that Rawlsian theory of justice, where we are actually concerned about, what is ethical and what is right, and how we protect the whole of society through our tax system. Now, we haven't quite seen it yet, although there is the narrative starting to come through about the fact that the government has spent an incredible amount of money, or promised an incredible amount of money. Tied with that, we have a very high unemployment rate. So again, who are we going to tax to raise that revenue to pay for all of these initiatives that the government has put in place? And around that, we've got the OECD doing a lot of work, and a lot of my work that I do is around international tax as well, where, the OECD has made it really clear in the tax context that fiscal stimulus and revenue raising is going to be the third and fourth part of our responses to this current crisis. Initially, governments went out and they looked around liquidity and income support. They're looking at solvency, etc. But at the end of the day, they've got to pay for this. And how do they do it? Through the revenue system. So again, the back end of our paper with some ideas around how we move from taxing, or placing a large emphasis on taxing the income of individuals, to other types of taxes, has become even more important than what it was when we wrote this paper.
So what are some future research directions suggested from your paper? And feel free to share what you're working on at the moment.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Victoria, because I think during this year, our research has changed so much, and we're seeing it take all sorts of different directions. So a few ideas that came out of the paper are certainly looking at the kinds of different systems we could put in place. So, for example, universal basic income is a concept that was mentioned in the paper, but not explored in any great detail. And subsequently, I've done some work with a professor at the University of Pretoria, Hanneke du Preez, on universal basic income that we published in the South African Journal of Accounting Research, because obviously, something like that is incredibly important for developing countries which don't necessarily have a good infrastructure and safety net in place for their citizens. So there's lots more work that can be done around the different types of taxes still, and we are seeing a lot of that. Some other work I've been doing is actually looking at the responses of other countries to the COVID-19 crisis. So, for example, Australia, when it comes to taxing corporates, we've never had loss carryback rules. So we all know businesses don't stop and start on 1st of July and 30th of June. That's not how business works, but it's how tax works. So we see profits in one year, losses in another year. We've always been able to carry forward those losses and offset them against future gains. But in this kind of environment, we need to think about whether we can carry them back. And, I've been doing some work around that with a colleague of mine, also looking at what other countries, comparable countries, are doing. And that work's submitted to a journal at the moment. And then suddenly in budget night, our government said, we're going to introduce loss carryback rules. So nothing to do with my research. Be nice to claim that was the case. Certainly not, but it's really exciting to see those kind of developments. And in this environment, having a government that has always, put up the barriers to any kind of loss carryback rules. We did have them for a very small amount of time, a long time ago. And suddenly they're being quite innovative in the way tax can actually address some of these issues.
So thanks very much, Kerry. It's been a pleasure talking with you today.
Thanks so much, Victoria.